Having now reached my goal of reading every book ever written, I am here to give you the definitive list of the best books ever published in the history of humankind. This is not in any meaningful order. We're starting with One's Company by Ashley Hutson. One's Company follows Bonnie, a private, cold, lonely woman who experiences an unfathomably tragic event and becomes obsessed with this sitcom Three's Company to cope with it. But she's clearly not coping with it. She has had to develop a very hard, emotionless exterior, and she's done that through focusing all of her energy into watching and thinking about and collecting memorabilia for this show. When Bonnie wins the lottery, she buys a rural property and escapes humanity to start the years-long project of building a perfect replica of the set of this TV show. There's a lot of detail about the logistics of getting everything perfect and building everything, and it goes on for quite a while, but it never feels boring because it's all coming from a woman who is so incredibly obsessed with every little tiny detail that you can feel the simmering heat of her eventual breakdown underneath of it all. While Bonnie is really strange and can be hard to understand, this book gives you enough information that you can anticipate her reactions to things, which are often very extreme, and that adds a lot of tension, especially in the building stage of this book. Not only is she so meticulously detail focused, like she needs replicas of the exact same vases that were in this apartment, she needs to find the exact same plants in this sitcom, she is also paranoid. She doesn't want anyone to know what she's doing, but she needs to hire contractors for this. She knows she can't do it on her own. She's terrified of having her deepest desires exposed to any other human being and then ruined, because without them, she has no coping mechanisms, even though they're very unhealthy. Once the replica is done and built, she sets herself up with a neighbor who agrees to drop off food for her every so often so that she doesn't have to interact with any other human being, and she can just shutter herself away here to accomplish her one goal, which is to reenact each and every episode of this show, playing each and every character in this show. Over years, she runs through the show, back to back to back, embodying each of these characters, to a point where she actually starts to lose herself. And then after years, maybe even decades, I read this a couple years ago, so some of the details are lost on me, her total isolation is broken. And that is where I'll leave the summary because you need to go read this. What I love about One's Company is that it's both very weird and very human, and that's a theme that you will see in many of these books that I'm going to talk to you about. Bonnie is simultaneously so unbelievably strange and also calm, collected, and logical. She's very intelligent, and she's intelligent in the way she's reached her conclusions about the world, which mostly boil down to that paranoia I was talking about, the fear of being perceived and the fear of having her desires perceived by others and being ruined because she's now looking at them through someone else's eyes. These beliefs become really, really extreme for her, but you can understand why she has them. And even though she has these beliefs, you know that Bonnie does need humanity and connection. But Bonnie thinks that she doesn't need that. And the book doesn't do a complete 180 on that by the end. It does remain faithful to both its character and its readers. I think it handles her character arc in a really satisfying way. It drives home her personhood as it's returned to her and the role of other people in that. Bonnie's intelligence and her clear logic make an incomprehensible character a little bit more comprehensible, and you also have the opportunity to kind of psychoanalyze her through all the little bits of information you're being fed about her and her past that she doesn't want to outright address. This book just sucks you right into it. The writing somehow manages to make you forget that this is such an unbelievable, ridiculous premise and that you are stretching your suspension of disbelief while you're reading it. It's hard to describe this, but it feels longer than its 250 pages, and usually if I said that, that would be a negative thing, but for some reason, it's a good thing in this book. I think because it takes place over many, many years, and it sucks you in and you're so immersed, you feel like you're experiencing these years with her. I'm not saying that it's slow paced because it's not. There are twists and surprises in this book, and you will be so focused on it the entire time you're reading it that you'll never feel a slow moment in there. But it does, in my memory, it feels like it took up a lot of space in my life for a long period of time. The tension in this book really pushes you forward, and also you develop this connection to Bonnie, even though she can be really weird and off-putting and sometimes cruel. I think the writing does a really good job of making you understand her and accept her even in her flaws. Next, we have No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. And first, I need to say that it's absolutely insane that this book has made it into this list, because you read the first quarter of this book and you're like, okay, 2 stars maybe? I'm not really feeling this. By the time you get halfway through, you're like, solid 3, but there's flaws. It's not the most interesting. It's not the most enjoyable to read. There are some good parts and there are some bad parts. Then you read part 2. All of a sudden, not only is the whole book 5 stars because part 2 is so good, you look back on part 1 and you think, now I like it more. Well, now I like it more. What? I cannot overstate how fucking good a second half of a book needs to be to accomplish that. So obviously no one is talking about this has 2 very distinct parts. The tone shift is so sudden, it feels as though the ground beneath you is no longer stable. The 2 parts cannot be read on their own. They both only work with the other one, so I have to ask you to suffer through the first part. The first part isn't terrible. It's not the second part, and you will not appreciate it until you have read through the second part. So it is hard to get into, for sure. In a lot of ways, this is the great Twitter novel, and it is written as though it were a Twitter feed, which means that it's mostly just like a whole bunch of very loosely, mildly connected thoughts and observations and humor. There's like a wisp of plot, but mostly it's just little bits of insight, and it is structured in like standalone paragraphs. And once you get into it, I will say that this does work about 70% of the time. Patricia Lockwood is really fucking funny, and she's also a poet, not in the way of like purple, flowery MFA language, more so in the way of she's very, very insightful and interested in the world around her. You do have to be a certain degree of like capital O online to get this first part. It's very internet-y. There's a lot of references to internet lore. Mostly like the main theme of this part, the messaging, is about how the internet and social media affects people, how they act, how they feel, and who they are. My sister is reading this right now, and she said that this part makes her want to throw her phone into the ocean. And then the second half happens. In part 2, the protagonist's sister finds out that the daughter that she's pregnant with, that was so excitedly awaited, has a genetic condition that will guarantee she won't survive for very long. This book has been explicitly political up until this point and remains so throughout the sister's high-risk pregnancy. There's lots of talk of abortion. There's the pain and the anger and the heartbreak, knowing that even if it kills his daughter, their father will be opposed to it until her dying breath. And then no one will even perform an abortion because changes in legislation have made this a legal gray area. Her sister has the baby, and the rest of the book is them loving this baby. The baby's condition has profoundly disabled her, and there are lots of musings on consciousness and disability, but it never doubts her humanity or her capacity to experience, even though they can't fathom what she is experiencing. And that's not a source of heartbreak for them. It can be a source of like curiosity and joy. At one point, they hold a toy piano up to her feet, and she kicks against it, and she lets out this howl of outrage, as if she was so angry that they had been letting her kick up against air and nothingness this whole time when she could have been kicking up against music. There's this quote here that I think about constantly, and I also think really captures the essence of the second part of this book, which is, there is no human being so unlike other human beings that it does not know what a kiss is. The whole point is love. I want to say I have never cried like this in a book ever in my whole life, and I have also never cried so many times about a book after finishing reading it for so many months. I cried when I was typing up my notes to talk about this book. Holy shit. Mostly a book will get a teary eye from me. Okay, this book, I was hyperventilating with sobs. My partner came over. I start talking about why I'm crying. My partner starts sobbing. It is so sad, but it's not sad in a way that is trying to make you sad. It's sad because it is so beautiful and so full of love. There are parts of this book that just thinking about them bring me to tears still. Kind of a spoiler-ish warning because I think it's pretty clear what happens in this book, and it's not like a shock or a twist, and it won't affect your reading experience knowing this, but if you don't want to know, because I know I wouldn't, skip for some amount of time. Throughout the book, it has been very understandably and reasonably focused on the grief and the love of the protagonist and her sister. And after they get home, once the baby has died, her sister's husband, the baby's dad, kneels at the foot of the couch and kisses the spot where she had lived her whole life, where they had learned, almost too late, that they could play patty cake with her. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because I'm actually like literally sitting here holding back tears at that. Still, I've cried about just thinking about that one scene maybe 6 or 7 times. This book is so sad and it's so beautiful, and it is so much more full of love than anything I've ever read. I know I've described it as that like 100 times already, but this book is love embodied in a book. And then you get to the very end and you think you're done, and you see that this is autobiographical. And also, that was stupid to think in the first place, because once you read this book, you will never be done with it. It will stay with you forever, and it deserves to. It is so thoughtful and clever and insightful and funny, and it has all of these meditations on grief and loving and social media and disability, and it's just like somehow the perfect book, even though like all of its parts on their own are not perfect. I want to beg you, because it is so hard to find people to recommend this book to read this if you have literally any interest in it at all. Please just stick through the first part. It will get better, you will warm to the writing, and it will be so worth it for the second part. Oh my god. Okay, next let's talk about another book with grief and love, but this time some horror in it, and that is Monstrilio. This book totally lived up to the hype for me, but I always love the grief-horror combination, so I kind of knew it would. In short, Monstrilio follows the story of the family of a young boy, Santiago, who in the first pages of the book dies from a lifelong medical condition. And his mother, lying in bed beside her son's dead body, cuts him open and removes a chunk of his lung, which she nurtures from a chunk of lung to a blob with hair that gets around using a tail to an almost but not quite human boy. This is told through 4 perspectives: the mother, her best friend who is also desperately in love with her husband, the boy's father, and Monstrilio, or M. It's not alternating perspectives. You'll be with one character for a long time, and then once you move on, you won't go back to them. It allows you to develop these really deep connections with these characters, even though you aren't spending all that many pages with each of them. And each time it switches, you feel both excitement for the next perspective and a little bit of heartbreak leaving the old one behind. This is a nuanced story of love, acceptance, family, grief, monstrosity, and queerness. It follows this family who loved their son that died and who want to mold Monstrilio into who Santiago once was, who need to learn how to accept his difference, his hunger, his monstrosity, who he actually is. It's kind of just like this handful of people who all love each other but don't really know how to, like don't know how to show up for each other in the ways that the other ones need. It takes place over many years as each of these characters grieve in their own ways and at their own pace, and as Monstrilio grows, there's this strain between them because they all have very different approaches to him that change over time. Wanting him to be Santiago, wanting him to be himself, or just wanting him to be more human. This book manages to have multiple different settings all be very strong. It's atmospheric across the globe. There's some very visceral body horror and gore in this book, but I wouldn't say it's central to the book. I think of this as more literary than anything else. It's definitely a book that will make you think about how you yourself feel, because it's offering you so many different perspectives and responses. It wants you to consider what you think about the characters' perspectives and how they're approaching Monstrilio, and it also wants you to consider what you would do and how you would feel in their shoes. It's just a really solid book in pretty much every aspect. Next book I want to talk about is Hunchback. This is a recent read and one that I know is going to stick with me, which is why it's managed to make this list. Even though I read it, I think, less than a month ago, it has filled a gap that I hadn't quite fully understood was there in my own understanding of my taste in fiction. And that is that I love to read about angry, disabled people who are also openly and unapologetically sexual beings. Hunchback follows Shaka, a woman with a muscular disorder that resembles the author's. She lives full-time in a care home that she actually owns that was left to her as part of her very large inheritance when her parents died, an inheritance so large that in this very confined life she will never be able to fully spend. Because she lives in a society that would rather not acknowledge her existence as a disabled woman, being both physically and socially inaccessible to her, deliberately outcasting her, she's only connected to the world through the internet and through her writings. She writes erotica for an online magazine, and she also uses the internet as a kind of void to scream into on this anonymous account, where she posts about all of the things that she wishes she had the opportunity to do, something that she recognizes as vain or childish, but that does help her alleviate her jealousy in a way, or her anger at the inaccessibility and oppression that she faces. Shaka becomes fixated on the idea of getting an abortion. She wants to get pregnant so that she can abort the fetus. To her, this would somehow solidify her humanity, and it would mean something to her and be symbolic to have the power to take away a life from a body that is forming it, a body that is dying in its fight to survive. One of the carers in this home reveals himself to be a self-proclaimed beta male, obviously an incel, because he's upset with Shaka for offering to buy an amenity for the other patients in the home. He's mad that she's flaunting her wealth and generosity when men like him have nothing. He then tells her that he knows about her secret account and he knows about her desire to have an abortion, and the two of them strike up a deal for him to impregnate her in exchange for a large sum of money. It is fascinating here, the power dynamic between them. Like, there are so many different axes of privilege and power happening in this relationship. It's interesting to think about who is taking advantage of who, if it's possible for both of them to be taking advantage of the other. From there, it gets kind of intense, but not in the way that I think you might be expecting. There's a jarring perspective shift at the very end that totally reframes the entire book, leaves you hanging and confused just long enough that when it finally clicks, it's very satisfying. I found this so intelligent and insightful. I thought it had so much to say. It was cutting, and it really makes you reflect on your implications in the systems and the attitudes and beliefs that have oppressed Shaka. It doesn't let you write yourself out of the narrative, and it wants you to be uncomfortable. And then on top of all that, the book is also very clever and funny. This is a novella. It's easily readable in one sitting and so worth every word for the ideas and the messaging that it's bringing to the table. I want everyone to read this book. I want you to examine your own ingrained responses to what it's saying and what it's asking of you. Okay, kind of a hard left turn here in terms of both subject matter and why I like the book. Next up is Big Swiss. Big Swiss is fun, okay? Let me have fun. Not everything needs to be thematically dense or have some sort of messaging, even though that is mostly what I want from a book. Sometimes you just want to have a little bit of fun, and you're going to get it from Big Swiss. Big Swiss follows Greta, a woman living in Hudson, New York, a place apparently absolutely chock full of ridiculously eccentric caricatures. Greta works transcribing sex therapy sessions, and she falls into lust and obsession with one of the patients of the sex therapist, who she nicknames Big Swiss because of her accent. In a world that in Greta's sometimes insufferable eyes is full of people that want to define themselves by their trauma, Big Swiss refuses to do so, even though she experienced a significant trauma. She was beaten almost to death as a younger woman. This fascinates Greta, and she is enamored by Big Swiss. And then one day at the dog park, they meet. And so begins a whirlwind romance, but not actually romantic. I would say a whirlwind affair, maybe. This is very atypical. Big Swiss is not like the expected romantic interest. She can be really cold and unforthcoming and private, and she's authentically herself, but in ways that are often like quite unlikable. And then there's Greta, who is equally, if not more unlikable, obsessed with Big Swiss, and also hiding this massive secret. She introduces herself as someone else so that Big Swiss doesn't know that she has listened to all of her fucking sex therapy sessions. A secret which has created this crazy power differential in knowledge and information about the other person that Big Swiss isn't even aware of. This book is extremely horny and sexual and erotic, and as someone who doesn't actually usually enjoy that in a book, though, as I was making this list, I was noticing like, wow, I describe a lot of these books as erotic. So maybe I need to reassess that. I felt that it was never like gratuitously sexual, unless if it was saying something. So if you don't really enjoy sex scenes, I don't think you'll find a problem with Big Swiss, because more than being erotic, it's funny, it's strange, it has these fucking insane characters, and so many of them, to a point that it's almost stupid, but it somehow manages to pull it all together and work perfectly. What really had me loving this book was the tension. Sexual, psychological, physical, every single kind of tension is present in this book. It is a one-sitting book because the tension makes it really, really hard to put down. You will be holding your breath the whole time, and the stakes feel unreasonably high for the actual circumstances. I gave this book to my mom for Christmas on an absolute limb, because it is so erotic, and it's like lesbians. Like, why did I give my mom the lesbian sex obsession book? She fucking loved it. I think it's the only book that I've given her that she's ever read. She loved it. I would be wary of recommending this to everyone because I don't want them to think about what it means that I'm recommending it, but I would recommend this to everyone. Next up is a book that I would not give to anyone ever because they would rightfully, reasonably put me in prison. It's a book that I have a really hard time saying is on my favorites list because it makes me seem like a criminal. And that is Tampa by Alissa Nutting. Tampa is about Celeste, a woman who becomes a middle school teacher with the sole intent of preying on prepubescent boys. And she succeeds. She grooms and begins a predatory relationship with this, I think, 13-year-old boy, Jack. And their relationship, in all its secrecy and forbiddenness, is under this intense pressure, and it spirals far out of their control into death and violence and even more victimization. Of course, this book is sickening to its core. There's a lot of commentary about how women like Celeste, young and white and beautiful, are better able to get away with crimes like these. It really dives into her psyche, which is so beyond despicable, it's almost difficult to describe. She has this tunnel vision, a total singular focus on preying on young boys, and every action she takes is with the end goal of accomplishing this. She doesn't even try to justify it. She knows it's wrong and she doesn't care. She is truly a sociopathic character, and it is horrific and suffocating to be inside her head. The thing about Tampa, and the reason that it made this list, is that the writing is phenomenal. I've said it before, but I don't think that you can have a book with this subject matter published if the writing is not absolutely impeccable. I think that's also what happened with Lolita and why people love Lolita. The writing is just so good. I've heard that so many times about that book and this book as well. It is so evocative, and I think the book knows it because that is often utilized for like absolutely fucking repugnant purposes. Every word feels deliberately chosen. There's this crazy, like really upsetting contrast because in terms of the writing, every sentence, every word choice is delectable. It feels like a treat. And then the content of those words and sentences and pages are nauseating. It's some of the most horrifying things that you'll ever read, and you have to square that. It's insane. The whole book is insane. I remember there being points in this book where I literally had to put it down and walk away with my hand covering my mouth. I just think that it's all done so incredibly well, and it does have things to say. It's not just disturbing for the hell of it. It is commenting on gender and youth and beauty and sexuality. But if you're easily upset or bothered by content like this, please do not read this book. I felt sick to my stomach for 3 full days after reading this. I will never reread this, but fuck, it was really good. Okay, let's talk about something a little bit lighter. This is a short story collection. I used to read almost exclusively short story collections. This tops the list, and it's insane that this tops the list because it's a science fiction collection, and I am not really a science fiction enjoyer, though this book made me rethink that. The book is Exhalation by Ted Chiang. This is science fiction that is so philosophical and thought-provoking and intelligent and insightful. It is astounding. The major themes, like pretty typically of science fiction, are free will and what it means to be human, which feel very broad, but in this book they are handled with such specificity and intention. It is the most thoughtful collection of stories that I have ever read. My favorite one in here is this story that takes place in a world where creationism is a scientifically proven fact. Like, God did create the earth. You can see it in the rings of the trees, and it's asking the question, what if God was real and he was indifferent towards us? What happens to your faith? There are so many gasps and gut punch moments in this collection where the pieces just finally click into place. And then to add on to everything that is so good about the stories in here, there are these story notes at the end that give you the context and the thought behind the stories. They're not spoon feeding you the message of the stories. It's more like Ted Chiang talking about what he was thinking about in terms of like the science aspects of these stories. And it makes the stories all that much more fascinating. If you are into science fiction, you need to read this. If you're into short stories, you need to read this. If you have any interest in this at all, you need to read this. It is incredible. All right, I'm going to stick another grief horror in here. This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno, probably #1 in this genre and #2 favorite book of all time for me. Taste defining. I read it and I almost just quit reading entirely because I was like, well, this is it. This is what I want out of a book. The tagline of This Thing Between Us is a man is haunted by his possessed Alexa. That is just a way to draw you in. It's a small part of the story. This book is so much bigger than that. Though to make it clear, if you go in wanting the haunted Alexa, you're going to get the haunted Alexa. You're not going to be disappointed on that front. This Thing Between Us is written by Tiago in second person to his late wife, Vera, who died in a tragic accident that ended up being politicized as an anti-immigration talking point. Tiago is destroyed by his grief and his anger and his heartbreak and the injustice of it all. It is such a vivid, realistic portrayal of the grief of losing a partner. And all of that is going on at the same time as all of these strange happenings. And they're just getting increasingly unsettling. Something to do with the Alexa, or maybe something to do with what is inhabiting the Alexa. Or is it inhabiting Tiago? He ends up trying to escape his grief and the well-meaning but not quite understanding friends and family back in Chicago by moving to an isolated, secluded cabin in Colorado where things just get more and more insane. This isn't really a story that can be summarized as cosmic horror or demonic horror or even really just horror. There are elements of all of those things, but it's always more than just a simple label that you can put onto it. And I don't want to say too much more than that because I think it's best going into this book with as little information as possible. I just think this is a perfect book. I understand some people think it gets a little bit too abstract and existential at the end. That does make sense to me, but to me, this is everything I want out of a book. It is dark, fast-paced, it's sad, it's beautiful, it grabs you, it does not let you go. Every new thing that happens in this book twists your stomach and hurts your head and makes you just want to keep turning the pages. I could really praise this forever. I will read anything Gus Moreno ever decides to publish. I am astounded at the skill that is present in this debut and at how perfectly it lines up with what I want to read. He fucking killed it. He brought me in with a weird, dark, almost kind of silly premise, and then he held me there in a chokehold the entire time. Speaking of a kind of silly premise, let's now move on to my favorite book that I've read so far this year, which is Sky Daddy by Kate Folk. Another taste-defining book for me. I feel like I have given a rundown of this book to everyone in my life, because when you say my favorite book of the year is about a woman who's in love with airplanes and like sexually obsessed with them, you kind of need to get into a long-winded justification of that. So I feel like I've talked about this book way too many times, even though I've really only talked about it once on YouTube, and I want to keep it brief as I possibly can. Sky Daddy follows Linda, a lonely, isolated woman whose singular goal in life is to die in a plane crash, because to her, dying in a plane crash is being chosen by that plane to take his hand in marriage. So obviously Linda is incredibly fucking weird. All she thinks about is planes. All she does is with the express goal of getting onto a plane to hopefully one day die in one. I think your obvious first thought is like, girl, why aren't you a flight attendant or a pilot? She tried doing the flight attendant route. Her first day of training, she got so incredibly horny that she literally just had to leave. Like, she actually could not function. So now she works as a content moderator, and she has one real connection in her life, her work friend, Karina. While this is a story of a woman who can only orgasm when she's in the air, it is also a story of the loving and accepting friendship between Linda and Karina, of Karina as Linda's branch to humanity, and of Linda as just as important to Karina. At first, because you're in Linda's head and she believes this, and because you're in Linda's head and you can see how fucking weird she is, you think that Karina is just being friends with her out of pity. But you quickly come to learn that that isn't true, that Karina is more complex than that. Things get really intense when Karina learns that Linda enjoys flying. She does not know the full extent of it, but she enlists Linda's help to condition her to be less afraid of flying so that she can go on her honeymoon to Hawaii. And Linda is so torn between helping her friend understand that she's safe on a plane and between this belief that is an essential part of her being that she will one day die in a plane crash. A lot of this book is Linda being torn between her weirdness and her obsession and her superstitions, and then being palatable and accepted by others. And what is an indication of insane talent from Kate Folk here is that despite Linda's flaws and her strangeness and her incomprehensibility, you come to love her and you're cheering her on. And Kate Folk makes you want for Linda what Linda wants for herself, which is to die in a plane crash. But you also love her and you don't want her to die. The end handles this perfectly. I won't spoil it, but it is a very satisfying and very deeply human conclusion. The pacing in this book is perfect. Even though it does get into a lot of detail about planes, it's never boring because it's coming from such a unique point of view. She's telling you details about these planes because she's horny about them. I felt so compelled to pick this up, and I found myself wishing that it was longer. Like I said, this is a taste-defining book for me. I fucking love a very weird and obsessive character who has to hide her unacceptable inner world that's always right there at the surface, but would jeopardize her one connection to humanity that is keeping her going. That creates so much tension, and it can be both dark and beautiful, and Sky Daddy is the perfect example of it. I'm now going to tell you 3 books all at once in quick succession. These are my 3 favorite Toni Morrison books. I'm telling them to you quickly because I think it is accepted by both readers and publishers of Toni Morrison that it's best not to have a really great comprehensive summary of her books before going into them. You pick up a Toni Morrison book, it does not tell you shit about what's in there on the back. Beloved is the first of hers that I picked up, and it holds a very special place in my heart. This takes place in the years after the 13th Amendment, and it follows a family whose daughter comes back from the dead. It's a haunted house story. It is a generational trauma story. It's a dysfunctional family story, and it won the Pulitzer Prize for a reason. Song of Solomon was the first book that we ever read in my book club, so also holds a very special place in my heart. It was the perfect book club pick. I don't think we've read anything as good as this was since, though Fever Dream is up there, and I'll talk about it later in this video. This book is more chock full of symbols, themes, messages, metaphors, than any book I've ever read before or since. It was so fun to pick apart and analyze, but you don't have to put that effort into it to still get something from it. This is a multi-generational family story. It's a treasure hunt. It is a journey across the country, and it is so much more than that, and so fun, but also so devastating and dark. It has magical elements. Amazing. It is, I think, her magnum opus. Then we have Jazz, which all I can say about Jazz is it is one of the most skilled pieces of writing I have ever read. She has somehow imbued into the words, sentences, pages of this book the essence of jazz music without it ever feeling pretentious or experimental. Jazz follows a web of people and places rippling out of this central act of violence. All of these books, and all of her books in general, are so intelligent and thematically dense and perfectly, incomparably written. No one evokes an image or an emotion or creates a character or tells a story like Toni Morrison. She has this way of telling stories through this interconnected web of people that are directly or tangentially related to the main story, so you get so much context. Her books feel very whole in that sense, and it also somehow manages to create an atmosphere through the characters, which I have never seen anyone else accomplish. She's my favorite author and by far the best writer I have ever read, and her books can be just as weird and dark and magical as the contemporary stuff that I typically enjoy reading. You could read any of her books. These are just my 3 favorites. The rest are not far behind. I'm going to throw a random nonfiction book in here. I used to be a massive nonfiction reader, and then I found joy in fiction again, and I never really turned back. I do not think that this is the most well-written nonfiction book that I've ever read, but it makes this list because it changed my life, and that is The Power of Strangers. It's about exactly what it sounds like it's about, how important other people, particularly strangers, are, and how to love them and accept them and connect to them in an increasingly isolated, disconnected, and suspicious world. I think COVID in particular, and also maybe just being so online, did something to me that really changed my quality of life. And that was, it took away a core belief that I now have redeveloped, which is that on the whole, people are good. If you are hurt or scared and you don't believe that, I'm sorry, you are living a much worse life. But I do believe that people are good. I used to hold those hurt and scared beliefs, and I think that I interrogated them at a surface level, but I never really changed how I approached the world and how I approached other people until I read this book. This guy just loves people, and he talks to all kinds of people throughout this book, and he makes you love them too. It's very funny and warm and tender and kind. And I remember vividly he says in this book that if you are open to people talking to you in public, they will just come up and start talking to you. You don't even have to do the scariest part yourself. And it's true. Something shifted in me while I was reading this book. It wasn't even necessarily an active choice. And all of a sudden, people were just coming up and having conversations with me on the street. It was terrifying, and I'm shy as hell and awkward and uncomfortable, but it was so lovely at the same time. Like I said, it's not necessarily the most well-written. I think if I reread it now, I would have some issues with it. I would probably think that it lacked nuance, but it really does deserve its spot on this list as a book that has fundamentally changed who I am and how I act in the world. We're getting down to the last few here. I am throwing in a very recent read, and for this to be so recent and make it on this list, it has to be really good. I have to be very certain that this is going to have longevity with me, and I am with this book because it was fantastic, and that's Fever Dream by Samanta Schweblin. This was the book we read in June for the book club, and it was widely loved because it is a masterful short novel that packs in so much without leaving anything shallowly explored. This follows Amanda as she lies on the brink of death in a hospital bed in a rural town that she was vacationing in with her daughter, trying to figure out how she got to this point. with the help of the young son of a friend that she made in this town who urged her to stay away from him. This book is dark and creepy, and some of the characters are totally reframed throughout the book. You'll start out perceiving them one way, and then at the end of the book, you'll look back on everything in a totally different light. What's so great about reading this book, both on your own and particularly in a book club, is that it is often giving you multiple ways to interpret what's happening, and none of the evidence that makes one thing seem true prohibits the other thing from being true, if that makes sense. Like, for example, you can really question Amanda's reality in this book, but nothing that points to the interpretation that she's hallucinating points away from this all being real. This book manages to have a really strong environmentalist message without ever feeling preachy. It's very deliberate and thoughtful. It's paced so well with the information that it's giving you. There are many moments in this book that will send a chill down your spine. As cliche as that sounds, it's the best way to describe it. And structurally, it being a conversation between Amanda and this boy is such an interesting way to tell this story, and it makes it very fast and very easy to get through. The way I would describe this book is just cool. I thought it was a really fucking cool book, and you should read it, and you could read it so quickly. Next, I have to throw in Milk-Fed by Melissa Broder. This is a book I've talked about many times before because I love it. It takes up a similar space in my head as Big Swiss. I think they have some similar content, and I like them for the same reasons. This is, again, about a woman obsessed with another woman. It is incredibly erotic, sometimes almost disturbingly so. It is both a delight and a horror to read. It's rivetingly fast-paced with these short chapters that push you through it and are in some ways teasing you with the opportunity to put it down knowing that you're not going to be able to. Milk-Fed follows Rachel, a woman who, on the advice of her therapist, is trying to distance herself from her mother. During this period of no contact, she falls in love with the woman who works at the yogurt shop, Miriam. She's an Orthodox Jewish woman that Rachel sometimes allows herself to get a very strictly regimented treat from because Rachel is suffering from an eating disorder. And they start this both extremely slow burn and somehow very fast-paced romance that is very will they won't they. It's very queer women figuring themselves out, and it's very tense because of Miriam's religion and Rachel's eating disorder. There's a really interesting contrast between these characters and their experiences of and relationships to their bodies. Where Rachel is all routine and restriction and regimentation, Miriam is neutrality and indulgence. And Miriam feeds Rachel. She creates these extravagant, elaborate frozen yogurt desserts that Rachel would never allow herself to have. But she can't say no to Miriam. And Melissa Broder manages to make getting a new flavor of frozen yogurt out to be the most significant, tense, and high-stakes moment that has ever occurred in all of human history. This is Broder's best work in my opinion. All of her skills are perfectly honed here to produce something that is hilarious and tender and earnest and very human. Next, I'm giving a specific award, and that is to the best audiobook that I have ever listened to. I don't typically listen to audiobooks, and I also want to say that I don't experience them in at all the same way as I do when physically reading a book. So I need you to take this with a grain of salt if you're planning on physically reading this off of my recommendation. The book itself might be shit, but the author's performance of it was so good I gave it 5 stars. Best audiobook ever goes to All Fours by Miranda July. Listen, controversial pick, I know. Some people hated this book, some people hated the main character, some people found this very boring, and I understand that, but I thought that her performance of this so precisely captured the tone that the words were setting that it was perfect. It was so perfect. And like you're thinking, of course it was. It's read by the author. But also, if you listen to audiobooks, you know that authors are often not very good at reading their own works. If it's a memoir, absolutely. But a piece of fiction, I mean, I guess this is kind of autobiographical. So maybe that is what's happening here. I just think that her just every so often broken up monotony was so perfectly served in this book. All Fours follows an artist who decides to go on a cross-country trip to cure her listlessness or her lack of drive or something indescribable in her life, and she doesn't make it more than half an hour outside of her hometown before meeting Davy, a young man who she falls into an emotional affair with. Never has sexual tension been created like it is in this book. Again, very erotic. This one is erotic in a different way because Davy and the protagonist are both married and they don't want to cheat on their partners, but also they are absolutely enamored with each other. And so they decide we just want to have penetrative sex. They decide first, we're not going to touch each other. And both of them keep pushing that boundary because they can't hold themselves back. While they're pushing this boundary, the entire time the narrator is telling her husband and child that she's on this cross-country trip. It's secrecy, it's wanting something you can't have, it's unlikable and strange, except not really in an interesting way, and then somehow she manages to make it interesting. The second half mainly focuses on the narrator's experience with perimenopause and figuring out her passions and what she wants to do with her life and her now unconventional family dynamic. I don't know, I just found it to be a really fun listen that was very well performed, and I was engaged the entire time, which is something that I find really difficult with audiobooks. We're so close to the end, I am throwing in a book that is somehow more plotless than All Fours, and that is Lost on Me by Veronica Raimo. There is no premise for me to recall to you here, and yet somehow this book captured me. Someone who loves plot, who is not an all vibes, no plot person. I am a plot lover first and foremost, and a boring book hater second, and yet this book is somehow not boring. Lost on Me follows a writer, Vero, in these loosely connected quips of her life in Italy with her irrational, dysfunctional, annoying, neurotic family. And it's great. It's very funny, and it gets kind of meta without patting itself on the back for doing so. It questions the significance of truth in memory. It explores her identity and how it shifts depending on what she believes is desired from her. And it leaves you wanting to come back for more. It's not necessarily trying to be super deep, though this isn't a shallow book by any means. It is doing things and saying things, and it's doing them flawlessly. It's probably the least impactful book on this list, but I found it to be so surprisingly interesting and enjoyable that I think of it as one of my most recommendable favorite books. There are very few people that I would not gift this to or encourage to read this. I want to put Ghostwall by Sarah Moss in here, but I have talked about it so many times that I'm starting to irritate myself, so I'm just gonna say, this is a great book. It's totally immersive. It puts you right inside the head of the narrator. You start to be able to predict her abusive father's reactions to the most mundane things that make it so tense, knowing how he's going to explode. And also, it's like a tearjerker at the end. Incredible. I'm going to try not to say more. I'm just going to leave it there. Ghostwall is great. We have 2 more left on this list. Next is the award for my favorite classic, and that goes to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I had thought that classics weren't for me. I was intimidated by them. I thought that they were dense and difficult and just not worth reading. And then I read Frankenstein, and it was so much better than I ever could have imagined. I mean, you know what Frankenstein is. I realized while reading it that I didn't actually have a very good grasp on what the plot points are in this book. I knew the major themes. I did not know what the ride this would take me on was going to be. It can definitely be dense and difficult and slow, but I think that all of that is worth it for the story and the messaging and the themes that it's exploring, and because once you read this, you will see its influences everywhere you look. Frankenstein has so much to say. It's so intelligent and thought-provoking and philosophical. Of course, it's about humanity and creation and becoming and ego, but it's also so much more than that. Personally, I think the most fun way to read it is as a gay allegory, and you will be shocked at how well that fits into the book. If you're a classics reader and you haven't got to it yet, you need to prioritize this. If you're a little bit intimidated by older books like I was and still kind of am, I can promise you that this one is so worth it. You need to read it. Okay, finally, this was not in any particular order, but this last one is my number 1 favorite book of all time, and that is Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. Now, have I read far better books than this in the many years since finishing it? Yes. Was this one of the first books that I read as an adult after moving away from nonfiction? And so I didn't really know how to read books or think about what I liked about them. Yes. Will any other book ever take the space this holds in my heart? Absolutely not. Stone Butch Blues, I mean, if you know, you know. It is both the great lesbian novel and the great transgender novel, and also kind of Nevada by Imogen Binney is both of those things. This one is the great union novel, which Nevada is not, but does have some wisps of. This is a cutting exploration of sexuality and gender without letting those two things take over the very human narrator of Jess, a butch lesbian who transitions into a man to try to live in peace. I don't believe that there is a more vulnerable book out there. This is a devastating and traumatic read, but in the end, a hopeful one. You do have to be in a good place if you have ever felt different from everyone else and you want to read this book. And if you ever see me mark this as currently reading on Goodreads, You need to call a welfare check. You might actually need to go straight to an emergency alert on everybody's phones. There's this really intense period of isolation in this book where Jess has transitioned and no one knows, and you are begging for him to tell someone and he can't. The isolation here is so profound, it is difficult to recall. I've thought about how one scene in there feels probably every week of my life since reading this book. And I think I will continue to. There is a vivid, visceral desperation to be seen and known and understood that I can't describe to you. There are many characters that come in and out of Jess's life, and they are all memorable and meaningful. You feel both incredibly connected to and also frustrated with and angry at Jess throughout this book. And it's atmospheric in an uncomfortable way because this is a very oppressive and familiar setting. This rivals No One Is Talking About This for book that made me cry the most. I think I started crying on page 4, and I don't think I stopped until the book was fully finished. Sometimes I think that I'm holding on to this as my painful, traumatic, sad read the way some of you are with A Little Life, but then I remember that this book isn't stupid and that it has things to say that aren't stupid. The summary says that it ultimately speaks to the heart of anyone who has ever suffered or gloried in being different. And I couldn't phrase that more eloquently or perfectly myself. Stone Bitch Blues touched me in a way no other book ever has or ever will, and it is everything that everyone has told you it is, and more. That is my list. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.